Olá, sejam todos bem-vindos à 7ª Conferência Científica Internacional de Programas Educativos para 50+. Estamos muito animados com esta 7ª edição, porque além de termos uma programação com palestrantes, professores, profissionais comprometidos com a educação 50+, nós estamos inaugurando uma nova fase da Rede Internacional de Programas Educativos. A antiga RIP 50+, passa a se chamar, então, iLearn50, e terá muitas novidades em seus futuros trabalhos. Nós gostaríamos de agradecer a presença de todos que estão aqui, nos acompanhando ao vivo, nesse primeiro dia de conferência, e também para você que nos acompanhará na gravação deste evento. Nós tivemos muitos inscritos de várias regiões do Brasil, de Portugal, da Espanha, de outros países da América Latina e da Europa. Nós sabemos da diferença do fuso horário, né? Eu falo diretamente do estado de São Paulo, do Brasil, e por aqui é bem cedinho, agora são 6h33 da manhã. Então, bom dia a todos que estão aqui no Brasil, acordando bem cedinho para acompanhar essa conferência. Mas teremos aqui uma manhã de muita aprendizagem, e é isso que nos motiva a estarmos juntos por aqui. Bom, a 7ª conferência da iLearn50, ela tem o objetivo de reunir pesquisadores que desenvolvem estudos no campo da gerontologia e educação, estudantes de graduação e pós-graduação que investigam a temática do envelhecimento e da aprendizagem, profissionais e demais interessados que trabalham com a prática educativa para o público 50+, e também as instituições, organizações, empresas que prestam serviços educativos e que contribuem para o bem-estar e qualidade de vida das pessoas com mais de 50 anos. O tema desta edição é Aprendizagem 50+, desafios e possibilidades, pois entendemos que há diversos fatores críticos que podem impactar diretamente a participação deste público em variados ambientes de aprendizagem. Mas a criação de novas possibilidades educativas, o acesso à educação, o incentivo à inclusão social pode apoiar soluções criativas para a transformação social da longevidade pela aprendizagem. Nós acreditamos no enorme potencial da educação para transformar o nosso mundo em um lugar melhor para envelhecer e viver. Então, é pensando neste tema que vamos apresentar aqui painéis, experiências educativas e workshops nesses 2 dias de conferência. Então, convido você a participar conosco, deixando aqui no chat os seus comentários, as suas dúvidas, as suas questões, para estarmos aqui juntos nesta aprendizagem. Então, neste momento, vamos dar início à sessão de abertura da 7ª Conferência iLearn50+. Temos aqui o prazer de convidar e de chamar a professora doutora Marina Troncoso.
Bom dia. Bom dia.
A doutora Marina é presidenta da CALMAS, Confederação Estadual das Associações e Federações de Alunos e Ex-Alunos dos Programas Universitários para Idosos, vice-presidenta da CEOMA, diretora da revista Universitária Sênior, presidente da Associação de Estudantes de Aulas de Formação Aberta da Universidade de Vigo e membro da direção da FEGAUS. Doutora Marina, muito obrigada, nós agradecemos por estar conosco aqui hoje, fazendo essa abertura oficial da 7ª Conferência da iLearn50+.
Bom dia, good morning. Bueno, es un placer estar aquí, un honor abrir esta conferencia. Muchísimas gracias, Karina. Yo hablo desde España, desde Vigo, en la costa atlántica. Estamos separados por Brasil, por el Océano Atlántico, y con Portugal muy próximos, a muy poquitos kilómetros. Muchas gracias, es un placer estar aquí. Bienvenidos a todos. Esta será una jornada fantástica de debate, de nuevas ideas y de un trabajo para mejorar la educación de los mayores de 50 o 55 años.
Muito
Cuando
obrigada.
quieras.
Agora eu vou transmitir a sua tela e fique à vontade para começar.
Pues comenzamos. Puedes pasarla. Pasa. Buenos días, ya lo hemos dicho. Good morning to everyone. Buen día y buenos días desde España. Muchas gracias a la organización iLearn50 por darme la oportunidad de abrir esta magnífica conferencia y enhorabuena por mantener vivo y activo el debate y las propuestas para la mejora de los programas educativos de 50 y más. ¿Pasas? CAUMAS, como ha dicho Karina, es la confederación que agrupa las asociaciones de alumnos de los programas universitarios de mayores en el territorio español. En ellos están vinculadas universidades públicas y privadas de todo el territorio. ¿Pasas? Tenemos grandes desafíos para mejorar la formación a mayores de 50 años, como los recursos sociales adecuados y suficientes. El acceso a los niveles educacionales, culturales y formativos, tanto reglados como no reglados, que proporcionan entidades y organismos estatales y privados. Entre ellos están las universidades de mayores, a las que yo pertenezco, pero también hay escuelas de salud, centros de mayores, centros culturales, centros cívicos, universidades populares, asociaciones de mayores. Todas estas entidades nos ofrecen no solo programas de salud, de promoción, de estilos de vida, de ocio, sino que también actividades de convivencia y participación ciudadana. ¿Puedes pasar? Karina, pasa. Ok. Tenemos como un gran desafío la concienciación de una oferta educacional permanente. Hay que desarrollar una educación permanente sin límites de edad, ni de educación previa, ni de ubicación física, ni sobre todo de una condición socioeconómica. Eso no debe ser condición para hacer llegar a todos una formación permanente. ¿Pasas? Las posibilidades de mejora de la oferta actual de los procesos de aprendizaje y de los modelos psicopedagógicos orientados a las personas de 50 o más años y promover modelos de buenas prácticas en el ámbito de la educación, tanto universitaria como no universitaria, y siempre acorde con los valores sociales actuales. ¿Pasar? Tenemos que avanzar en el uso de las nuevas tecnologías de la comunicación como herramienta facilitadora de nuevas oportunidades de formación para las personas de más de 50 años. Debemos promover la formación de profesionales con competencias pedagógicas adecuadas al aprendizaje de las personas de más de 50 años. ¿Estamos? Tenemos que conseguir que las administraciones dejen de considerar la educación de los mayores de 50 un tema más social que educacional. Hay que considerarla una estrategia fundamental en cuanto a los derechos de las personas se refiere con la participación de todos los ciudadanos. Toda la sociedad debe estar implicada en la formación de las personas mayores. Tenemos muchas posibilidades, como es implantar programas que permitan a los docentes adoptar sus enseñanzas a un importante colectivo de personas con diversidad de conocimientos previos. No todo el alumnado, no todas las personas mayores tienen la misma formación. Hay que adaptar esa formación a los niveles educativos de cada grupo. Además, realizar una buena campaña de promoción de los programas para personas de más de 50 con el fin de que todos los interesados puedan elegir la enseñanza que deseen o la que necesiten. ¿Estamos? Las autoridades nacionales y de la Unión Europea, bueno, y también de Brasil, de Argentina, de América, del resto de Europa que no pertenece a la Unión Europea, tienen la obligación de prever, conocer y aceptar los cambios que se deban hacer con el fin de conseguir la excelencia en este tipo de enseñanza para mayores de 50, fomentando al mismo tiempo un diálogo generacional e intergeneracional. Esto es muy importante para estar incluidos en una sociedad intergeneracional y no quedar aislados en un gueto donde los mayores tengan muy pocas posibilidades de una participación social. ¿Pasamos? Más posibilidades son las iniciativas socioculturales dirigidas a las personas de más de 50 años, que hoy son muchas, diversas y muy cualificadas. Existen múltiples modalidades que conviven entre sí, como asociaciones culturales, agrupaciones de creatividad manual, artística o literaria, entidades de formación permanente, aulas de la tercera edad, los RIP en Portugal, voluntariados culturales en entidades públicas, los programas universitarios de mayores, en fin, todas estas posibilidades tienen que ser aprovechadas y mejoradas. Además, necesitamos que los programas socioculturales requieren la intervención de profesionales especializados, no solo profesores, sino psicólogos, pedagogos y también trabajadores sociales. Las actividades que se ofrecen a través de conferencias, seminarios, talleres de creatividad, actividades de ocios, tienen que responder a los intereses de las personas mayores, de las personas de más de 50 años. Como todos saben, la OMS ha definido la década 2020-2030 como la década del envejecimiento saludable, que determina, entre otros objetivos, cambiar la forma de pensar, sentir y actuar con respecto a la edad y el envejecimiento, solicitando que las comunidades fomenten las capacidades de las personas mayores. Esto es fundamental, reconocer y promover las capacidades de las personas mayores. Debemos garantizar el derecho al aprendizaje a lo largo de toda la vida, proporcionando a todos los alumnos de todas las edades y en todos los contextos los conocimientos y las competencias que necesitan para desarrollar todo su potencial y vivir con dignidad. En los que nosotros en España llamamos ODS, que es los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible de la ONU, el número 4 dice que es necesaria una educación de calidad. Los docentes son esenciales para lograr los resultados del aprendizaje y alcanzar el ODS 4, que es la transformación de la educación en una educación de calidad. Además, esto es importantísimo, es necesaria financiación. Los países deben contar con una financiación significativamente mayor y sostenible para lograr la consecución precisamente de estos objetivos sostenibles y que estos recursos se asignen y supervisen de forma equitativa y eficaz. Las inversiones y la acción en el aprendizaje digital deben guiarse por 3 principios clave. Dirigirse a las personas más marginadas. Suministro de contenido educativo digital gratuito y de alta calidad e innovación y transformación pedagógica. En CAUMAS, confederación que yo presido, trabajamos en la transformación digital. Esta transformación requiere el aprovechamiento de la tecnología como parte de esfuerzos sistémicos más amplios para transformar la educación. Hacer una educación más inclusiva, equitativa, eficaz, relevante y sobre todo sostenible. Las posibilidades que ofrecemos en CAUMAS a través de toda nuestra formación online es de bienestar, tanto físico como mental, cultura, tecnología, emprendimiento. Tenemos más desde el 2018-19 que comenzamos de 350.000 participantes y 75 proyectos cerrados de formación para personas mayores. Las posibilidades actuales desde CAUMAS, por ejemplo, ¿cómo aprenden nuestros usuarios? Pues tenemos más de 500 clases, más de 20 cursos, en activo todos, más de 1000 vídeos a disposición, juegos entretenidos, infografías, encuestas, noticias, podcasts, en fin, un montón de medios de información al alcance de todos los que se quieran conectar a través de nuestra plataforma para aprender todos los días que quieran y sobre todo elegir los temas que más le interesen o más les gusten. Además, actualizamos y tenemos las aplicaciones para iOS, Android, desarrollo de web, manejo de TICs, todo lo que significa que una persona de más de 50 años que no estuviera acostumbrada o habituada al manejo de las TICs pueda hacerlo de una manera fácil, asequible y sobre todo muy sostenible porque la inversión es muy poca. Un teléfono, una tablet, un móvil, un PC, es suficiente para alcanzar y poder disponer de esta educación permanente. Nuestra oferta de Caumas queremos que haya una profesionalización de la formación de los mayores, una mayor facilidad de uso y accesibilidad, con métricas avanzadas, más de 2.000 contenidos categorizados. Queremos propiciar la interacción y la participación entre el alumno y el docente o el profesor o el conferenciante. Y además hemos abierto una nueva área privada para centros donde cada centro o cada colectivo pueda desarrollar sus contenidos específicos. Es decir, no solo alcanzamos en general, sino que si hay algún grupo específico dentro de nuestras asociaciones que quiera hacer algo específico, le abrimos un centro, un área privada para que desarrolle el contenido que desea. Y nada más, esto es un pequeñísimo resumen de las posibilidades y oportunidades para mejora de los proyectos educativos de mayores de 50. Unos proyectos fundamentales en esta sociedad que cada día está más envejecida, que cada día somos más personas mayores y cada día necesitamos más atención, sobre todo más formación para participar en el mundo, para estar considerados como ciudadanos de pleno derecho, para acceder al conocimiento y para tener una relación intergeneracional adecuada y solidaria. Y nada más, hasta aquí hemos llegado. No tengo nada más que decirles, que muchísimas gracias por su atención. Disfruten del desarrollo de esta conferencia, a la que auguro un gran éxito y les deseo muchísima suerte. Muchas gracias, es un placer haber estado aquí. Karina, muchas gracias. Saludos al profesor Luis Jacob, que no ha podido estar aquí, pero un saludo a todos y que vaya muy bien. Um forte abraço.
Muito obrigada, doutora Marina. Nós que agradecemos por esse pequeno, né? Como disse, essa pequena história de quantas possibilidades nós temos em relação à aprendizagem 50+, e quantos trabalhos a Calmas tem sido pioneira em fazer todos esses trabalhos com essas pessoas. Então, nós que agradecemos muito por compartilhar todas essas experiências. Nós temos agora, então, o professor Dr. Luiz Jacó. Ele conseguiu aqui estar conosco, chegando aqui de uma viagem. Mas
olá, Marina.
Bom dia, Luiz.
Bom dia, Marina.
Bom dia.
Acabado de chegar, ainda estou no aeroporto. Acabado de chegar da Hungria. Está vento, está muito vento por aqui. Mas pronto, queria cumprimentar obviamente a Karina e a Marina e dar as boas-vindas a todos os participantes da nossa conferência. Vai ser claramente 2 dias de aprendizagem, como tem sido o nosso lema, aprender a partir dos 50+. Por coincidência também ontem fiz 51 anos, por isso também já posso aprender e já posso ir para a Universidade Sénior e para as UNATIS. Já estou pronto para continuar a aprender. De facto, era só mesmo para dizer as boas-vindas, bem-vindas à nossa conferência online, Portugal, Brasil e Espanha, e que todos possam participar e aprender nestes 2 dias com estes excelentes oradores que temos. Por isso, a todos bem-vindos e continuação de bom trabalho.
Obrigada. Bem-vindo.
Obrigada, Dr. Luiz. Dr. Luiz é presidente da iLearn50, a rede internacional de programas educativos para 50+. Ele é presidente e fundador da RUTES, da Associação Rede de Universidades da Terceira Idade, desde 2005 em Portugal, e professor adjunto nos institutos politécnicos de Bragança e Santarém, nas licenciaturas de Educação Social e Gerontologia. Muito obrigada, Dr. Luiz, por conseguir estar aqui.
Bom trabalho, até já.
Muito obrigada, até já.
Muito obrigada.
E gostaria também de agradecer a Marina, muito obrigada por essa sessão de abertura. Então, vamos dando continuidade aqui à nossa programação. Muito obrigada, doutora Marina.
Muito obrigada, adiós, un placer, y ahora salgo de la pantalla y me quedo enlazada para ver las otras comunicaciones. Gracias.
Bom, então vamos dando continuidade aqui na nossa temática, da nossa programação desse primeiro dia. E antes eu gostaria aqui de deixar uma pergunta para vocês que estão nos acompanhando ao vivo, aqui de várias regiões do Brasil, temos de Porto Alegre, de Portugal. Então, vocês podem colocar aqui de onde vocês estão, para que a gente possa identificar a amplitude do evento, de onde vocês estão falando. Vou deixar uma pergunta aqui. Na sua opinião, quais são os fatores críticos da aprendizagem 50+? Então, vou colocar essa pergunta aqui no chat, para que vocês possam também nos sinalizando quais são esses fatores críticos que podem impactar de uma maneira significativa na participação ou não participação em projetos educativos para 50+. Compartilhe conosco aqui no chat. O painel, esse primeiro painel, trata exatamente deste tema, os fatores críticos da aprendizagem 50+. Nós teremos a mediação deste painel pela doutora Dulce Mota, mas houve um contratempo e não será possível a sua participação. Então, eu gostaria aqui de apresentar o nosso palestrante e orador, o professor Dr. Brian Findsen. Ele é pesquisador, consultor em aprendizagem e educação de adultos, especialista em Later Life Learning, com publicações de vários livros e artigos científicos sobre o assunto. Ele é conselheiro da Age Concern Hamilton e membro da Associação Neozelandesa de Gerontologia. Devido ao fuso horário, foram vários outros motivos, o professor Brian não pôde estar conosco, mas ele nos fez a gentileza de gravar antecipadamente a apresentação que nos faria ao vivo, e isso permitiu também que fizéssemos a tradução e a legenda, a fim de facilitar o acesso dessas informações a todos. Então, gostaríamos de registrar que o professor Brian fez de todo o possível para enviar a sua apresentação, foram feitas algumas gravações e várias tentativas de envio. Então, nós queremos agradecer muito ao professor Brian por toda a atenção que teve com a iLearn50 e com os participantes da 7ª conferência, e também pelo cuidadoso material que preparou para nós. Então, neste momento, eu vou compartilhar a apresentação dele gravada e espero que todos possam acompanhar.
Greetings from New Zealand. This is Brian Findsen, and I'm pleased to be able to present this conference presentation to you on the topic of critical learning factors for 50+. Just a few words first about my own background. I am an adult educator. I've been working in several universities, mainly in New Zealand, but also in the United States when I was a postgraduate student in North Carolina State University, and many years later at the University of Glasgow, where I was a professor of adult education. So I'm pleased to be able to bring some of that background to this presentation on this occasion. This next slide is really an overview of what's to occur subsequently. So first up, we look at the purposes of lifelong learning. This is important to provide a foundation for understanding where learning in later life comes from. After we look at the purposes of lifelong learning, which are diverse, then we look at the context of learning. The heart of this presentation really is looking at the teaching and learning environment and looking at the critical factors that are embedded within that. So we look at a number of those factors and then move on to looking at effective learning principles according to Paulo Freire. And of course, you're very familiar with Freire's work as a Brazilian adult educator. And then we look at barriers to lifelong learning. These barriers have been categorized into social, psychosocial, and situational and institutional. And we'll be looking with some emphasis at the institutional, given that you are an agency providing learning for older adults. And then finally, I'll make a few comments. The next two slides are really an analysis of lifelong learning and its importance. It's really significant to understand lifelong learning before we really look at later life learning, which I guess is a close cousin. So this particular slide indicates a relationship between four different themes and that of lifelong learning. So at the top is the learning economy, which obviously relates to the extent to which older people are engaged in the economy of a country. The next circle relates to how individuals develop within society, and more particularly their own personal development. And then we move into active citizenship, which looks at the extent to which older people are engaged in society and in terms of active aging in particular. And then finally, social inclusion or social exclusion, which looks at the extent to which older adults can participate in society. We'll now look at the purposes of lifelong learning in more detail. First up, the enhancing the learning economy. Most governments are concerned about having individuals who are knowledgeable and skilled and adaptable, and as workers can contribute to the global labour market, or more particularly the national one, as part of the global labour market. However, if you look at policies to do with the economy, most are oriented, understandably, I guess, to youth rather than older adults. But my argument here is that older adults are really an essential part of the economy and shouldn't be discarded. It's really important that older people have the ability to continue to work as part of the learning economy. Next theme is one which I think iLearn50 Plus network has close affiliation, and that really is around the personal development of people so that individuals can achieve what they desire to achieve. In retirement, arguably, people can be more creative and need some resilience to be able to achieve their own personal development. Now, in adult education, liberal adult education is an example of where personal development comes to the fore. Next up, we have the active citizenship. This is the idea that the active citizen can be engaged in communities for the betterment of society overall. And in particular, with older people, volunteerism is a strong theme. That is the extent to which people like myself, and I guess members of your group, would volunteer in their societies, not necessarily getting paid at all, but their volunteerism helps prop up society, really. And this is a case where social capital amongst older people can be developed, particularly through friendships. which come through group learning, such as in the iLearn50+ movement. Finally, we have social inclusion, the opposite of which, of course, is social exclusion. This is the extent to which people are perhaps inadvertently excluded from society. And this can be a result of the gender or race and ethnicity or other spheres of exclusion. And a response from education has been to try and broaden the scope of the diversity of people who are involved. And this is an issue for most organisations. And combating age discrimination, I would argue, is an important component of looking at the lifelong learning society. Now, this particular slide emphasises the fact that learning occurs in all sorts of different contexts. Most often, we learn just in our daily lives and everything that we do and reflect upon our actions, and hopefully that learning goes forward into future activity. So amongst older people, informal learning, as for other groups of people, will come to the fore. Now, the iLearn50+ movement perhaps might best be categorised as non-formal education, and this is education which is still systematic and organised, but the context is free from hierarchy and tends to be more democratic. Formal education, most of you would recognise as taking place in institutions of the state, such as universities and polytechs and such like. Now we have a picture here of an older person who is engaged in a hobby of or it might be a hobby of constructing a table through his own initiative. And what this slide brings to the fore is the difficulty of trying to categorise this kind of learning. Is it leisure or is it paid work? Is it for money? Is this person doing this for money? Is it a job, or is it a leisure activity? So we need to try and avoid categorisation into vocational and non-vocational areas. Now, this particular slide really is to help analyse the nature of later life education, later life learning. And there are three main spheres, the first of which is to look at the role of the state or the role of government. Quite typically, this is illustrated in the kind of policies that get developed that may have an impact on older learners. Universities, or at least the public universities, are part of the state, and so obviously the policies developed by universities have an influence on the learners who come in. And the extent to which older learners are actually encouraged to go into universities is a matter for further discussion. Now, next up we have the market. The market is related back to the notion of the economy. So whatever's going on in the market potentially has quite a strong influence on what happens for people in later life learning. You may have heard the phrase of the grey economy. This is really to indicate that that older people can contribute actively to the economy. Last, here we have something we call the civil society. Not necessarily an easy concept to decipher. However, the civil society sometimes is identified through the family and through social networks that operate, and arguably the iLearn50+ movement is part of the civil society. Now you may wonder why there is something here called the sociological imagination. This idea came from, well, obviously a sociologist, C. Wright Mills, way back in the 1960s. But I've put it here really to try and to understand how older learners might be captured in history and their position in society and through their own personal development. So C. Wright Mills uses the three areas of history, social structure, and biography. So history can be looked at in a number of different ways. Obviously, this will depend on where a nation is located within the globe and relates back to whether the country has been colonized or not. This will have an impact on people. From a social historical point of view, there are particular events that we may have experienced for ourselves or may have observed from the past. If we take, for example, votes for women. As a New Zealander, I'm proud to say that New Zealand had brought in votes for women in 1893, and I think it was the first country in the world to do so. But that particular event obviously has flowed through to contemporary society. Then we have the cultural aspects. So how we define masculinity and femininity are important to understand. The roles of men and women have been prescribed historically in different countries, but we can change those roles. Next up, we have social structure. That is, in effect, the ways in which people are divided, perhaps, in society as a result of their gender or race, ethnicity, social class, etc. And of course, age is the one that's most pertinent here. And so age or ageism is quite a significant issue to be resolved in most countries that I know of. Finally, biography. This is to acknowledge that our own personal development is a subset, really, of social development or social history. And most closely, if we look at family structures and dynamics, it helps to explain how we have developed as individuals. This next section, which I've entitled Learning for Effectiveness, Critical Factors, is at the heart of the discussion today. So we're looking here at factors within the teaching and learning environment which we nearly always need to consider to look at whether we can be really effective in the learning that occurs. Now, whilst I look at each of these aspects in isolation, they do not exist in isolation. There's an interactive effect that occurs from looking at, for example, the context and the teacher and the learner and so on. So I'll discuss these separately, but in reality, they intermingle. The only possible exception here might well be in what we call self-directed learning episodes, where arguably a teacher is not present. Other people might counter that argument, say, well, it's implicit that a learner has been influenced by a teacher, but have that debate some other time. So let's have a look now at each of these 6 particular factors. The first up, the context. Now, I've headed this the context again because we really need to grapple with the context of learning to understand the potential and the limitations that the context or environment might present. So we can look at this from a general point of view, or we can look at it at a more specific point of view, or if you like, from the macro and the micro perspectives. So when we look at the context in a general sense, we might start off by looking at the social context. This will always, I think, from my point of view, be important to understand the ways in which people may be encouraged or discouraged in a society in terms of their learning. We know that for many governments, little concern is expressed around learning in older adulthood. It's as if sometimes older people are invisible in the schemes presented and through policy of governments. So that social context is important. And that's, as I say, the second point there really picks up on whether social and educational policies either include or exclude adults, or older adults in particular. And it's no surprise that very few policies, whether they're social or educational, actually identify older learners as a special class to be considered, nearly always enveloped within the phrase adults. Now, is learning for older adults taken seriously? As I mentioned before, probably not if we rely on the state, but on our own initiatives, we can say yes. And iLearn50 is an example of where you've taken older adult learning seriously. Now let's have a look for a moment at a more specific context. This is looking at the 6 points, as I've mentioned before, and the immediate environment, is it suitable for learning? So we can look at different aspects of that. We can look at the physical environment. Is the venue suitably ventilated? Are the chairs of sufficient comfort? Is the lighting appropriate? There are many different aspects of the physical environment that we can look at, and most usually we can deal with those fairly quickly. The psychological environment may be slightly more difficult to negotiate, and this is because some people may, from their past, bring in a fear, if you like, of the learning environment. And for those people who have had unsuccessful or intimidating experiences of schooling, may be wary of anything to do with education. So quite often some people will bring an anxiety to the learning environment, which hopefully organisations like iLearn50 can overcome. Now, the social aspect is really important, particularly for older people, many of whom have suffered from social isolation, perhaps related to COVID mandates, etc. So the social environment is really important, that people feel at ease, they can develop perhaps some friendships from their learning, and go ahead successfully. I've mentioned here just marketing of programs. Does it inadvertently favour some groups in terms of the context? So very often marketing does actually inadvertently attract some people rather than others, and you have to decide whether that's intentional or not, and if it's intentional, whether you want to do anything about that. In this next slide, we consider the role of the teacher in learning. Now, some people would argue, well, obviously the teacher has a major responsibility to exercise skill in the teaching and learning situation. So I have a series of questions here related to the teacher for your consideration. So, is the teacher knowledgeable and empathetic? Now, sometimes the word teacher can conjure up particular ideas, and sometimes the word facilitator may get used, particularly in an adult learning context, or the word mentor if people are working more on a more personal level. But whatever the word that's used, the person who is responsible for organising and implementing the teaching is usually called the teacher. So, is this person knowledgeable? Well, there's a lot of life experience that older people bring to the situation, and much of that knowledge is accrued through the life experiences. Is the person empathetic, understanding and seeking to know more about the learners. That's what I think we mean by empathy there. Does the teacher have a credible history suitable for teaching? I think we need to be a little bit careful here that we don't put off somebody who may be just doing some teaching for the first time, who may be perfectly capable. But we're really here looking at what kind of skills and knowledge that the person may bring that establishes credibility. What professional development is available for the teacher? Now, the whole area of professional development in teaching has gathered much more importance recently. So what sort of training might a person get for teaching? How much of that is necessary? Is professional development something that everybody should be made to undergo? That is, should it be compulsory or should it be voluntary? And so this issue really of professionalisation is a major issue to be considered. And my hope would be it wouldn't be too overpowering for a particular organisation. Does the teacher use life experience in teaching, whether that teaching be their own teaching or others in a group? And certainly I think it helps when somebody as a teacher can build upon and use examples from their own lives to illustrate points that they're making. Equally, does the teacher provide opportunities for others in the group to express their views? So that's, I think, a matter more of a democratic approach. Does the teacher or authority evaluate teacher effectiveness? So this really looks at the issue of whether an organisation or agency or a provider provides feedback to a teacher as a result of their teaching. Now, often this kind of feedback happens without a lot of intent. For example, when after perhaps an iLearning50 plus event, a lot of people come out smiling and joking and said, "I've had a really great time." So that's, at a superficial level, does provide some important feedback. If your organisation so wishes, you can then look at deeper levels of evaluation, which in effect look at longer term outcomes from learning, rather than just, if you like, the happiness indicator. Next up, we have the notion of the curriculum. Sometimes we use the word syllabus, but more often in adult education circles we'd use the word content. So who decides what is acceptable content for a learning event? For organisations, this can be a little bit fraught at times in terms of what kind of risk-taking there might well be in terms of content, but it's always a matter for an agency to, I guess, think through what are the boundaries, so to speak, of the curriculum, and whether that boundary might be extended. So where does the curriculum come from? In adult learning context, as I've said before, it often comes from life experiences rather than some expert saying this is the way things should be. And hopefully I'm not being too much of an expert here in developing this curriculum for you today. Does the curriculum reflect a bias? In this case, perhaps an unintentional bias. For example, in gender. Quite often the case in the likes of the University of the Third Age movement, or the U3As, which may have some affinity to your group, this becomes quite an issue, because when we look at participation, of who gets to participate in the older adult learning context, usually women dominate. I think I'm yet to see in a more general program where there are more men than women in a particular society. For example, when I was I've done some work in Taiwan recently, and when I've looked at learning events there, certainly the case that the woman came to the fore a lot more. Now, this is probably as a result of what the curriculum is or what the content is, and it has an appeal more to women than to men. So the issue then is for organisers to look at events that may attract men, more to the case. And that kind of relates to the next question, who has expertise in curriculum design? So you may wish to have somebody who is organising the curriculum to seriously consider activities which may encourage more men to participate, if that indeed is an imbalance, and it usually is. And lastly here around the curriculum, in what ways is the curriculum evaluated and by whom? And just as before I mentioned about teaching and whether that is evaluated, so is the curriculum, the content evaluated? And who is in the best position to do that? Are you going to nominate some people from in the group who presumably have more expertise? That's a decision for you to make, but we should always keep in mind whether the content is stimulating and encouraging learning rather than discouraging it. This next slide relates to the nature of the group. So we'll look soon at the individual, but this is focusing on who was there for the learning event in a group situation. So here are some questions which I think you may wish to consider. Is there a suitable size group for specific learning tasks? Well, yes. Typically, the literature on group dynamics stresses that between 7 and 10 people in a group is a great number to have in terms of encouraging participation. Once you get into larger numbers, it's much more difficult for a teacher to be able to get any one individual to participate. That's because they may feel intimidated by the fact that there are too many people in the group. Who gets to participate and who does not? So again, we can have a look at the actual teaching situation and the group, and see who was there and who was not there. And if, as I said before, if there's a bias, then perhaps we can do something about that by trying to encourage new members in the group. Are the dynamics of the learning event monitored? So this really goes back to the group dynamics literature again. Who hasn't been to an event, a group event, where somebody has been, in a sense, overriding the opinions of the other people, and frankly just says too much in the situation? And usually it's left up to the teacher to try and negotiate that person out of the situation, so others can contribute. So too much from one individual usually means that other people have been closed down. Does the group composition reflect the goals of the organisation? So if, for example, you have a goal of diversity and encouraging new members from maybe subgroups in society who haven't been before, how are you going to go about that and make sure that the people within the group are actually appropriate to the maybe broadened goals of the organisation? So most agencies that I know of tend to have an issue of perhaps quite a narrow membership in terms of maybe ethnicity and so on. So there may be a challenge here to try and broaden the membership between and relationship building. Task completion is obviously and relationship building, as the phrase suggests, is about building up the friendships and the social networks within a group. Now, these are not necessarily opposite ideas, but the issue here is getting an appropriate balance between getting something done and getting to know more about the people who help to get the task done. So this is nearly always an issue in a group situation. And quite typically for groups such as the iLearn50+ network, relationship building is very important. And no doubt you know this already. Finally, in this section, we have the learner, or the individual learner, or the, more formally, I guess, known as the student. I prefer the word learner in the older adult context. So let's have a look now at some of the issues here. So what is the motivation for engaging in learning? That's the motivation for the individual learner. Why are they bothering to come along? Why do they come or engage in something like the iLearn50+ network? Now you can probably think of a whole lot of different reasons. And indeed, probably in adult education, no area has been more researched than the issue of motivation. And motivation leads to then participation. So it's important to try and understand the motivation of the learners. In the older adult context, obviously people want to know more knowledge about particular topic areas, but usually just as importantly is the social dimension. Right? So we know that as people get older, the numbers of people in the networks tend to shrink. So it's really important that in a situation of learning that people can be, have that opportunity to get to know other people. What is the prior experience of the learner in an educational context? So I've alluded to this one before. So the prior experience can be either positive or negative. So if you've had a great experience in a learning event, you've had great experiences in your network, you're likely to come back again, right? Because you enjoy it. On the other hand, if someone has a negative experience, they may need a lot more encouragement to return. So that's human nature really in operation here. So prior experience can be either positive or negative or a little bit of both. What qualities does the learner bring to the learning event? So individual learners, as I said before, they have their own personal histories, and some people may bring really positive attributes like an openness to listen to other people, and the opposite of which, of course, would be a lack of openness and something that's not particularly helpful to the situation. So we try and enhance here, of course, the positive qualities that a learner may bring. So what benefits accrue for the learner as a result of participation in the learning program? So if you look at your learning program, what are the benefits? And these benefits probably relate back to the motivation for the learner to start with. Right, so those benefits may be of many different sorts, but the knowledge-based benefit comes to the fore, obviously, in liberal adult education. But as I mentioned before, the social dimension, the friendships, the social networks established, the social capital, all these things are positive benefits of learning. Does a learner need assistance to participate? Or encouragement of some sort? Now, this assistance may well even be at a physical level, as the old people, so to speak, when they come to a learning event, they may need physical assistance to get there in terms of transport, but once at the event, they may need wheelchair access. There are all sorts of aspects that need to be considered for people who may have a disability. And there's a relationship, of course, between disability and older adulthood, because proportionately more older people have disabilities than younger people. Now, does the learner favour a specific learning modality? I've suggested here the visual. So, in addition to the visual, of course, we have the auditory or the kinesthetic. So there are many different learning modalities, and the central point about this is to make sure that these are indeed diverse, because different people have different preferences. Now, lastly, we'll talk here about methods or techniques of learning. So here are a series of questions for consideration. Is there a full range of effective methods used in the events? In this particular case, my talking to you is what we might call the transmission model. It's basically one person talking to a group. So that has tended to have been, say, in university settings, a predominant mode or method of operation. But of course, that's a rather stunted perspective. There are many other ways to learn. Do the methods and techniques employed allow for active participation? So if it's one-way transmission, the likelihood of getting feedback is negligible. So active participation, we know, is really important to align with active aging. So usually, as the next question is suggesting, more democratically driven methods are those which encourage more people to participate. So, you know, the sort of learning circle, so to speak, is a classic that's involved, and that's tend to be more democratic. And even in a Zoom situation, we can have a more democratic arrangement to enable people to be able to speak when they want to speak and to contribute. Does a teacher get feedback on whether the chosen methods work for the learners? So feedback and evaluation are almost interchangeable words. So as I've mentioned before, evaluation and feedback on any aspect of the teaching and learning environment is really important. So that can be the case in terms of focusing on the actual methods that a teacher uses. To what extent and efficacy is online learning used? I realise that this very presentation comes to you in an online sort of environment, right? And this has been accelerated really in the last couple of years through the pandemic, where face-to-face in the same room kind of interchanges have been less possible. So the online environment is much more prevalent, and indeed in the universities around the world this is the case. This is happening as well. And lastly, are learning events age segregated or age integrated, and to what effect? So an age segregated situation is where you have groups of older people without any younger people present, or perhaps even middle-aged, so-called middle-aged people. This is where decisions have been made that an agency will operate to focus on older people, and that's who participates. The age integrated, of course, is the opposite to that. That is usually based on the argument that if you have learners from different generations, they provide different perspectives related back to the kind of social history or personal histories that they bring with them. The whole area in adult education, older adult education, of intergenerational learning, intergenerational education, has recently come to the fore. And this is where the emphasis really is on cross generation, communication, and learning events. This can be possible for an older adult learning group as well, to deliberately connect with younger people and have some sort of interchange of skills and information. The next section of this presentation relates to barriers to learning. These have been categorized in this case as the psychosocial, the institutional, and the situational. There have been other ways of categorizing barriers to learning, but in this case we'll focus on these three. The first set of the barriers to look at are what we call the psychosocial barriers. The word psychosocial, of course, can be broken up into the psychological and the social, and you might argue that the psychological is a subset of the social, so hence the phrase psychosocial barriers. So these are barriers that are experienced or believed by individuals that are actually internal to the person and may have been built up over a person's learning history. So the first set might be described as self-inhibiting perceptions. So the notion that I'm too old to learn, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Phrases like this, which sometimes are actually expressed by the learner himself or herself, come to the fore, and basically we say that's nonsense. All right. The perceptions are real, but what is being expressed is probably false. All right, so we need to find ways to encourage the person to overcome those particular perceptions. Now, there may be, from poor previous learning experience, some barriers as well. The notion that I hated school or I was belittled by a teacher harks back, I know, to very early learning days of schooling. But there are some even older adults now who will still have a number of these perceptions around learning and education. So we need to provide a learning experience that's going to be really positive for them in the first instance, so that they will overcome those previous inhibitions. We might say that the psychosocial barrier is a lack of self-esteem and or power in a situation. So again, these are going to be challenging to overcome, but a person's self-esteem can be altered by encouragement from others that they are doing well, they deserve to be in a learning situation. And the issue of power is probably a much larger issue to address, but some people do feel relatively powerless in their lives, and they generalize this powerlessness to the learning situation. So again, we need to be able to encourage through active participation to overcome any feelings of disempowerment. And finally, here I have some groups may feel that they are discriminated against. I mentioned before, this may be a result of gender, race, ethnicity. I think is another classic example. In my own country of New Zealand, but broader than New Zealand too, Indigenous people quite often will say that they feel discriminated against, and that has resulted sometimes in their developing their own ways of learning and own groups of learning. But if we're looking for a society where people from various diverse backgrounds come together, we need to overcome discrimination. The next set of barriers might describe as situational. Now, these barriers are usually a result of something that's not working within the actual learning environment itself. Now, I've mentioned here that these barriers are usually fixable. So unlike the ones to do with the the person, internal to the person. These are usually external to the person and are socially constructed. So if they're socially constructed, they can be socially deconstructed. So we can make a difference here. So a situational barrier, here are a few examples, may well be disability. So as I mentioned before, there is an interaction effect between older age and disability. So there are going to be more people coming to a learning event in later adulthood who have some disability. So we need to do our best to try and overcome that disability, whether it be physical or some other means. So in the physical realm, simple things like what's the venue for the learning event? If it's in a building that's several stories high, is there an elevator? And usually, of course, this will have been checked out by an organizer previously. Are there transport options suitable for a person to be able to get to the learning event in the first place? You know, are the bus schedules or the train schedules suitable for and close by the learning event? So those are some physical aspects that can be looked at. From a social perspective, it may be that the person wanting to come to a learning event just doesn't know anybody else to go with. And it's only really, in some instances, people who have a friend who goes to a learning event that thinks, that friend's come back looking pretty happy and about things, so I think I'll go along to that event next time with that person. So, you know, that whole issue of sociability, again, comes to the fore. And if the person's a little bit like me who likes a coffee or tea, if there's a cafe or some way of getting refreshments during or before the event, then this quite often helps, encourages a person to be more active. And finally, although this is not there are lots of other possible situational barriers, but health, of course, is always going to be a component. Whether a person has poor vision or a poor hearing, this may be an impediment to learning as well. And within this area of barriers, the final part here relates to the agency or the provider or the institution, or in this case it might be to the iLearn50+. So these are the barriers which unintentionally usually are set up, which can be disestablished. So these are barriers erected by the provider that may be negative for some participants. So once you find out what those might be, then you do something about it immediately if you can. Now, marketing can be heavily biased. Liberal adult education, and indeed older liberal adult education, has tended to have been captured, so to speak, by middle-class women. This at least is a critique of the movement. So there's a challenge there in the marketing to illustrate that all older adults can come to this event, and if there are barriers, we'll help overcome those barriers. So marketing needs to be particularly sensitive. Another institutional barrier that can be remedied is the curriculum is too narrow or fails to encourage active learning, and I've mentioned this point previously under the heading of curriculum. Too much bureaucracy. In most non-formal education events run by older adults for older adults, in my experience, they have limited the bureaucracy that's there. So the University of Third Age movement has been quite explicit about minimising the bureaucracy that's there, so that, for example, enrolment procedures are made very simple, and the fee structure is such that the event may well be free or a very low fee. So minimising bureaucracy is an important thing. The venue suitability, I've mentioned that one before, about access to the venue, that's a significant thing. Fees too high, I've mentioned that. Poor selection of teachers, you only need to have someone to have a fairly negative experience of a teacher who's not particularly skilled for that person to be put off. So comes back to the agency making sure that they've selected the right sort of people in the first place. Uninspiring teaching and learning methods. So again, diversity of methods and techniques usually helps overcome this particular barrier. This next slide is in relation to the learnings from myself and for lots of other people, derived from Paulo Freire, as the famous Brazilian adult educator. So Paulo Freire has had a significant influence right throughout the world, and I have, in a sense, used some of his ideas and related those to older adult education in this instance. So I'll quite briefly go over these, but this should not be new to you. The educator and learners jointly construct knowledge. So there's no big distinction made between the teacher, the educator, and the learners. So in Freire, in terms of the teacher is sometimes a learner and the learner is sometimes a teacher. Adults take increasing responsibility for their own learning. I think that's self-evident. We allow people to be autonomous and responsible. And teachers and learners are indeed co-learners, operating with mutual respect. Learning is an active process as a result of what learners do for themselves rather than what teachers do for them. So this is really emphasising that the individual has responsibility to develop their own learning to the extent that they can, with the help of the group perhaps. The teacher encourages learners to make their own decisions and choices rather than an imposition. Freedom and responsibility are primarily in the hands of learners, but teachers are not exempt from exercising responsibility. So sometimes a self-directed learning movement can move, the ideas can move to an extreme where they feel that teachers have no role to play in self-directed learning. This might be a mistake depending on what the context is for the learning. So there's always a balance there between, if you like, the power of the learner and that of the teacher, if indeed the teacher is present. Now some final comments. Later life learning serves many purposes. It goes back to looking at the lifelong learning themes. Not easy to get governmental buy-in for supporting older adult education, so we may look in vain sometimes for the state to continue to provide funding for older adult education. Older adults participate for many reasons, indeed they do. Constructing a suitable context for learning is fundamental to the effective learning episode. Most older adults favour relatively shorter learning events where barriers are minimised and socialisation is emphasised. Many of the teaching and learning components can be important to consider all the time. All right, so we've reached a stage now of towards the end of this presentation. I have some reading there in English, and you'll see that quite a lot of my own writing has been included here. I've worked quite a lot with Martin Formosa from the University of Malta on learning in later life, and so that's been a pleasure. And the other references I'll refer back to my mention in the PowerPoint slides. Although Jarvis and Peter Jarvis and Alex Withnell, both from the UK, are important colleagues and have made an active contribution to this field for you to consider. Then this final slide, basically, obrigado. Thank you for the opportunity to work with you. And if you need to contact me, my email address is there. So best wishes for the future of your agency.
Dr. Brian, novamente, nossos agradecimentos por sua participação, pelo excelente conteúdo que nos trouxe, para que possamos refletir sobre esse grande guarda-chuva, podemos dizer, que são os fatores críticos da aprendizagem 50+.